a short class today. It's only 50 minutes long, right? So we need to get launching on this. The lecture I gave it yesterday was 50 minutes exactly. So we'll try to go a little shorter today so you have time to ask questions at the end. But we'll go as quick as we can. We're going to cover a ton of ground today. All right, so to get our bearings and to kind of get set first, I want to remind you of what we've covered already in our lectures. So the very first lecture, we talked about what Christian ethics was on the whole, right? And that the primary purpose of Christian ethics is recognizing and living into the normativity of Jesus. Okay, the life and teachings of Jesus. The second one, we spent some more time on how the Sermon on the Mount sort of embodies that for us, not just as the way to get to Jesus, but as the way of Jesus. Right? So the Sermon on the Mount is not just the way to get to Jesus, but it's also the way of Jesus. We talked about that last time. You shouldn't have to write that down. You guys know both of those things already. We covered all of that stuff before. Today, we're going to try to answer a really big question that I think has a very simple answer. But the big question is, given that the Sermon on the Mount is what it is, right? That it's the way to get to Jesus and it's the way of Jesus. What kind of people would we have to be to live out the Sermon on the Mount? What kind of people would we have to be to take that seriously? And the answer to that question is we'd have to be a virtuous people, right? We'd have to be a people of virtue. Now, how does that actually work? How are we going to get to that? And I'm going to talk about these three huge concepts, and we're just going to deal with them in piece by piece, and they should kind of fit together for us by the end. We're going to talk about this context for virtues, concepts of self, and community. They all start with the letter C, because I'm also a pastor, and 3-point sermons that all start with the same letter is how you keep jobs. This is the deal, though. You can call them whatever you want, but we'll progress through this as we go again, so you kind of have some bearings, so it's not just all like, hey, I'm just throwing a bunch of information at you. But when we start with talking questions about virtue, we're going to talk about some really heavy hitters, some like really big names, and we'll get to that in just a second. But before we do all of that stuff today, I want to pray together. So let's go ahead and close your eyes and quiet yourselves for a second, and then we'll pray together, and then we'll launch into what we're going to do, all right? Gracious and good God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the chance to be together, to learn and to grow. We pray that you would allow us to grow in wisdom and in stature. As we gather to pray, God, we are thankful that you are gracious and merciful when we are not virtuous people. But God, we're also thankful for your grace and mercy that you enable us to become virtuous people. Please meet us where we are. Encourage us and strengthen us. Allow us to have the courage to become people who live by virtue. Amen. All right. So I want to introduce you to a couple of people real fast. And you will want to know these names. We're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle. I'll write them out so you can see it. All right, so Plato and Aristotle are two philosophers. They're two Greek philosophers. They're two Greek philosophers from the same period. They actually overlap, but not exactly. Plato is a little bit older than Aristotle, and that's kind of, you just sort of need to know that. I'm just going to throw some dates on the board so you can have some background information. But basically, Plato lives from 428 to 348 about. They weren't keeping calendars the exact same way, but that's roughly when he lived. BCE or BC. So this is, either way, it's before Jesus, right? So this is a while ago at this point. Aristotle lives from 384 to 322. Same period, right? So they have a substantial 40-year overlap almost. One of the reasons that's important is because these guys are both part of the same sort of school of thinking, right? Legitimately, universities start here. This is where people begin to start to take philosophy and things like this really seriously, and they start to ask huge questions. People before them have also asked huge questions, but the Greeks figured out some kind of system where these guys could get paid just to think about this stuff and teach about it, right? And so Plato and Aristotle overlap significantly in terms of time, and they overlap significantly in terms of context and era and culture, but they have some sort of really big differences. And this is how I want you to think about it. This is not 100% perfect. This is really broad strokes just to introduce you to these guys. So one of the enormous differences they have is Plato is going to be known for something called universals. All right, so if you just want to note that Plato goes with universals and Aristotle goes with particulars. Now, both of these are overgeneralizations, okay? But sometimes these overgeneralizations are helpful just for us to get our hands around something or an idea. So Plato, big picture universals. Sometimes you'll see ideals here, like ideals, ideals instead of universals. Doesn't matter, you get the idea. This is enormous stuff. Aristotle cares about particular things, like the detailed stuff. And I'll give you an example of what this is. Here's just like a fun, silly kind of example. Plato would probably be mad at me for using it. But how do you know you're sitting on a chair? Because you are, right? But how do you know it's a chair? This is a question that is silly, right? Because we're talking about chairs, it's not that big a deal. But this is a question that the Greek philosophers have spent a lot of time on. Like, how do we know what something is? Right?
We all agree upon it.
What was that?
We basically all agree upon this is a chair.
All right, one option is we all agree that it's a chair. But what if I don't? What if Jerry's just obstinate? This happens once in a while with Jerry, right? What if he just decides, nah, I'm not calling this a chair anymore. From now on, I'm calling this a pencil. Right? Would it still work like a chair if Jerry called it a pencil? Yeah. But what's the idea of chair there? I was like, wait a second. I don't know if I'm interested in this or if this is very irritating. Both? It's kind of both, right? This is what all philosophy is, by the way. This is how it always is. So Plato has an idea. Plato's idea is you know it's a chair because somewhere there's an ideal chair. There's a form of a chair. There's a universal chair. And so Plato, you want to know this word form. If you want a helpful way to remember this, when you're a kid and you play with Play-Doh, which is not spelled the same way, you form things out of it. Right? Plato cares about form. The point of this is that he's going to say you recognize this as a chair because you actually remember what the perfect chair is. Right? And Plato has a really weird backstory here and some really strange metaphysics. You don't have to get into all that stuff. Just know that his point is there's some ideal version of a chair. This one is close enough to that ideal version that you know what a chair is, right? And so you could call it a pencil, you can call it a jacket, you can call it whatever you want. You know deep down in like places you can't even access all the time that this is technically a chair, right? And so this is Plato's universals. Aristotle flips that, right? Aristotle is going to say, you know it's a chair because you've seen 1,000 other chairs, right? That all these chairs have something in common, but you only access that through the particulars, right? So you know it's a chair because it's got 4 legs, and chairs always have 4 legs, or almost always have 4 legs. You know it's a chair because it has a back and a seat, right? These are particulars. There's a chairness to this, right? There's a quality, a characteristic of chairs, right? So that is one of those like fundamental differences between Plato and Aristotle. And again, really broad strokes, but essentially this is kind of what they're arguing about. So how do you get to know anything, right? This is kind of the way into these questions. The piece for us that's important is this is going to shape how they think you learn how to live what we'd call the good life, right? How is something good or bad? Well, as you would imagine, Plato's going to say something's good because it aligns to the ideals of a thing. So a good chair is closer to the perfect form of a chair than a bad chair is, right? Or a broken chair maybe. Aristotle's going to say that's not actually has anything to do with it, right? It's to the degree that the chair holds up these characteristics, right? And we're going to get into how Aristotle's going to define this because we're going to spend more time on Aristotle now than Plato. But you want to have those two thinkers in your head and you want to be able to distinguish between the two of them. With Aristotle is going to say this is not helpful. This universal, these forms, even if they exist, you couldn't access them anyway. Who cares, right? But what is helpful is something he's going to call virtues. And Aristotle gets credited with sort of beginning to talk about and enter into this world of virtues. And Aristotle this is actually something that probably was already in his culture. It probably already existed, but Aristotle sort of puts these together into one kind of collection so we can start to understand how they're thinking about virtues. One of the key ideas for Aristotle around virtue, a key quote to kind of get your head around is to know the good is to do the good. The point of this for Aristotle is that the good doesn't exist until you actually do it, right? Sitting around thinking about universals, sitting around thinking about what would be great in a situation or what would be the perfect response to a situation, all of that's fine, except for unless you actually do it, this doesn't exist, right? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't do anything. To know the good is to do the good. This is one of those this is when you look up Aristotle quotes, this is one that's going to show up all the time because this is kind of the starting point for his understanding of virtues. So virtues is just a word we use to talk about practices that show our values, right? What is it that we value? What do we practice that collectively we agree is good, right? So can you guys think of any virtues? You guys all know some of these. What are some virtues you can think of? You're at Aug Prep, we talk about them all the time. Give me one virtue.
Integrity.
Integrity, that's one we talk about virtue, right? Any other ones? Can you guys remember any of the other ones?
Perseverance.
Perseverance, right? A lot of you guys are trying to do that in this lecture right now. Respect, excellent. Right? These are things that as a school, we've said, if you have these, if you do these, it will go well for you here, right? If you don't have those 4 virtues and you go to Aug Prep, you still might even be able to get through Aug Prep, right? Some of you guys are gonna be able to graduate anyway. But if you practice these virtues, if you have these as virtues in your life, your time at Aug Prep is going to go way better, right? Because they were determined that this is the kind of things we want you to have as an orientation and as a practice that's going to allow you to live well in the world. Okay, how do you get to make sense out of what counts as good for virtues for Aristotle? I'm going to introduce you to 2 kind of big words. Don't be scared off of them. One's big, the other one's not that big, but they're both Greek words, and actually, I'm going to teach them to you this way, even though it's not perfect, because I taught classes yesterday. So you want to learn the word ontology and telos, and I'll tell you what they mean in a second. But these 2 pieces are going to be really important for Aristotle to get at what virtue is. You need to have both of these in your head. So ontology, for our sake, we're just going to define this as being or existence. You might say what something is, like its isness. I don't even know. It's a weird. Anyway, have this in your head for an ontology. Okay, telos is the end or aim of a thing. All right, this is why it exists. Sort of. You might say that, right? The point here for Aristotle, and the thing to have in your head when we talk about virtues, is that it has to have both of these. It has to be good for it to be virtuous. It has to be a thing that just in and of itself is good. In its being, it's a good thing. But it also has to be aimed at the right place, right? That's kind of one of those keys that we miss with virtue sometimes. Let's talk about patience for an example. This is my favorite one from growing up. This is my favorite example of this. When I was growing up, I had to take the bus all the time to get to school. And I would go wait at the bus stop, and once in a while the bus would be running late. And my mom would say, be patient, right? This is like what her favorite thing to tell me. And I would always get frustrated, because it's like when somebody tells you to calm down when you're not calm, right? It doesn't calm you down, it just makes you more frustrated, right? And this is how I was when I was told, be patient, be patient. So I would be patient, and patience, I would ask why, and she would always say, because patience is a virtue, right? On our list of virtues, patience shows up on there. Why, or what has to happen for patience to be a virtue when I'm waiting for this bus? You can answer out loud, right? What has to happen for my patience to be virtuous waiting for this bus?
For it to help people.
For it to help people, if somehow my patience helps people, that would be virtuous. That's not the answer to this question though, right? but you're jumping on the right track, and I appreciate that. Anybody else have an idea? This is not a hard question. You just aren't used to thinking this way about things. That's okay, right? The bus has to show up, right? My patience is stupid if the bus never arrives, right? There's nothing good about it. There's a point where if the bus doesn't come, then impatience is actually the right response, right? Because the goal of both situations is I'm supposed to get to school. So if I wait and it turns into 2 o'clock in the afternoon and that bus hasn't shown up yet, my patience wasn't virtuous, right? It was foolish. That's an important piece to keep in mind, because as you look at virtues, and we're going to talk about these in some other contexts later on, but we're going to talk about like medieval virtues and different community virtues and things like that. There's a point where you might deem something virtuous, but if it actually destroys the thing you're aiming at, then it's not a virtue, right? Even if it seems virtuous. And we can talk about and unpack that piece later. That's not a crucial piece. The crucial piece to remember here is that a virtue has to have both of these, right? It has to have an ontology and a telos. Okay, I want to hit on one more thing before we get off of this sort of context for virtues. And it's this. Does anybody remember what Augustine said about virtues from our last lecture?
He says that virtues comes from the image of God.
All right, there's an exact quote, Jerry. Anybody else have that quote in your notes? If you find it, just say it out loud. I've got my back towards. He says, ordered loves is the brief and what? Anybody have it? I know you have it in your notes from the last lecture. True definition? There we go. Brief and true definition of virtue. All right, so this is Augustine, right? Ordered loves is the brief and true definition of virtue. His point, we talked about this last time, right? That there's a hierarchy to love. So if you start with God and you build down, if every time your loves are in the right spot, then your actions will become virtuous, because your ontology and your telos are both aimed in the right place, right? This is Augustine. This is not Aristotle anymore, right? And that's important to keep separated. There's one weird detail of history that I don't know if you guys have ever run across before. Augustine writes about virtues. Everybody writes about virtues at different points, right? But Augustine writes about them sometimes. But Augustine never actually read Aristotle, right? We're pretty sure if he did, he had very, very limited access to Aristotle. He had pretty good access to Plato, and Plato had kind of ruled the day for a while. The theologian who gets credited with rediscovering Aristotle is Aquinas. And that doesn't happen for like 1,000 years. Does anybody know why the church didn't read Aristotle?
The Western Roman Empire collapsed, and the books were like kept in the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire, so the West didn't have access to them.
That's exactly it. We just didn't have access to it, right? They didn't reject Aristotle on purpose. They just didn't have a chance to read them, right? When Rome gets sacked, all this stuff goes somewhere else, right? And when it does, what ends up happening is Augustine writes on the virtues, but he doesn't interact with Aristotle. So the only point of that is it's just kind of a fun story to know. But they end up naturally overlapping in some places. This is one of those. Aquinas, on the other hand, when Aquinas writes the Summa, he's going to spend a lot of time unpacking Aristotle when he gets to ethics. It becomes a much bigger deal in the Middle Ages than it was earlier in the church history. And this is part of the reason for it. Okay, if you have this concept, if you have this sort of framework, ontology and telos, those things connected, right? Let's move on to this part is gonna, on the surface, feel maybe really random and strange, because it's connected, but we'll come back to how it's connected. So you have this idea of virtues, you have a context for talking about virtues. We're not actually gonna talk about specific virtues today, but I wanna get into a second thing. I want you to know these 3 categories. So pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. Okay, so for our sakes, pre-modern, it doesn't really matter the ages or the times exactly, but let's say 0 to 1700. That's not perfect. You'll find people who give you much more specific numbers. For our purposes, the dates don't matter all that much. It just gives you a framework. For modern, we'll say 1700 to like 1970. Actually, let's not do that. Maybe just confuse you. Let's go 1700 to today. And then put a question mark after today. All right, because it's kind of true. And then postmodern, we'll say 1970 to today also. But no question mark on today. All right, so when you see these names, these are eras of thought. These are ways of thinking about the world and how the world makes sense, right? So these categories are ways philosophers and literature people have tried to make sense out of the way people thought about or think about the world they inhabit. You'll see these in art also. They don't mean the same thing in art, and you see them every once in a while like in film and some other places. Just know we're talking about philosophy here. I don't know how they work in architecture or whatever. That's all different, right? But in philosophy, the way they work is this. Each of these eras is going to define some really key basic things about the world in different ways. And those ways are going to impact how you think about the world you inhabit. So let's start with a really big one. How do you think about time? Let's start here in modernity. If I asked you to draw time, all right, just like it's a weird question, you can't draw a clock. How would you draw time, or what happens over time? What would you draw?
A wheel.
A wheel?
As in like the inherent like cyclical nature.
Cyclical nature of time? Okay, we'll come back to that one. Is that what you said too?
I'll say circle.
Circle, that's kind of like a wheel, right? Who would draw a line? Right? You want to put like, if you put like the year 1700 here, and you put today here, right? Which way is this line going? All right, it's going this direction, right? There's a couple of things that happen here. In modernity, moderns think about time on a line. Okay, this is a huge shift in the history of the world. Up until like the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, people did not think about time as a line. It wasn't linear, right? This is something we've added to the conception of things. Okay, on top of this, not only is it linear, what else is happening to time? What was that? It's constant, right? It stays the same and is always doing something. What's it doing? If it's moving this direction, what's it doing? It's always moving forward, right? That's what happens with a line, right? You have to be either going forwards or backwards. We only think of time as moving forwards, and the thing we connect to going forward, you can look at this universities you apply to. UW-Madison's slogan is forward, right? Why? Because we associate forward with progress. In modernity, time moves this direction, it moves forward, and it progresses. All right? You might not believe this, right? There might be a scenario where I say like, hey, we're in October, we're almost done with October. If you had to compare September to October, which one's better? You might not always say October. But if I asked you over a longer stretch and said, which is better, 2023 or the year 500? Right? Instinctively, in your bones, you should think 2023. You've been taught to think that, right? That we have a natural affinity for the time we live in, but also we just think time gets better, right? Not all of us, and not all the time, we're gonna get into that, but modernity certainly thought that, right? If you look at any of the stuff that was written before World War I, everybody thought they'd figured it out. Everybody thought the world was just getting better, getting better, getting better, right? And that we were moving towards a sort of utopian vision of what humanity could be, right? This is the way we think time works. Jerry's hit on something else though about time, which is in pre-modern, I said they don't operate with time on a line, they operate with Jerry's wheel, all right? For the pre-modern, time is a circle. And it moves in a direction, but it continues to repeat itself. There's a couple of reasons for this. There's probably 1,000 reasons for it. I don't know those. I know a couple that are important. The biggest one this is how your life works if you live before 1600. This is so hard for us to get our heads around because it's such a different framework than what we actually functionally do now. They did not wake up and go to school every morning. They didn't wake up and go to the factory every morning. They didn't, right? What did they do?
Agriculture.
Agriculture. So in agriculture, you plant, things grow, you harvest, right? And then guess what? You do it all over again, right? And you do it every single year, you do it the same. So time does not move forward or backwards. Things don't progress or regress. Things grow. And then they get harvested, and then they have to be replanted, and then they grow again. And it doesn't matter where you are in the cycle, that pattern is going to keep repeating itself consistently, right? This is the way they thought about time. Okay, I share the time one with you. Postmodern, this is a philosophy that comes out of modernity. It comes after modernity. That's what post means. They're going to operate with a similar understanding of time. So pre-moderns. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough for our purposes. Ironically, agriculture has nothing to do with those guys, right? Like that's not why they're doing it. In postmodernity, there's just a sense of history and tradition still impacting the present. And this one, when things are done, they're done, right? When you're done with the past, you can move forward. Postmodernism recognizes that history keeps popping back up into our timeline. So there's an image of time being circular again. And some of you guys, when you instinctively go that way, you're living into that piece. That's cool. I'm not telling you which one's right or wrong here, right? I don't care actually about this stuff all that much, except for this next part I think is super interesting. Besides just time, they also had an understanding of how the world makes sense out of who you are, or how you make sense of the world. And in pre-modernity, they had something called SCR, and in modern times, we have something called ICR. For both of these, the CR is construction of reality. Any guesses as to what the S would be in SCR?
Social.
It is social. So this is social construction of reality. The point of this, and particularly about how you think about yourself, how do you learn or know who you are in pre-modern times? How would you determine it?
The group, the tribe.
The group. Your family would tell you, right? Or your town, your tribe. You have a very small group of people around you that help shape for you what reality is. You only know yourself this way. You're not going to school, you're not going off to university largely, you're not watching movies made in a totally different part of the world, right? The people you have around you are your whole world, right? You're not rising up this rank of like the idea, you're not sitting around thinking, well, someday I'll be president, right? It doesn't exist before in this window, right? What does exist is stability and a very ordered sort of cosmos, right? Like you know your spot in the world because you've been told it. You've been taught it to yourself, right? And you don't, the idea that you would break out of that is sort of nonsensical to them. It just wouldn't make any sense at all, right? They wouldn't laugh at you, they just wouldn't know what you're talking about. What does the I in ICR stand for modern?
Independence.
Independence, that's a great guess. That's not quite it though.
Individual.
It's just individual. So it's right on the same line, Edwin. You're right there, man. All right. The individual construction of reality. This is a absolutely crucial turning point in history. We don't have a specific day for this. This just is a movement that happens. At some point, this change and this shift happens. And what happens with it is now your identity becomes your responsibility, right? Your self is about who you decide you are, right? You will absolutely have influences from other places. Your family will tell you things about yourself. Your school will tell you things about yourself. But you are an individual. You face the world alone. You have your responsibility to the world and vice versa. But that's the way we think about self now in modernity becomes very individualized, right? We talked about this last time when Hauerwas keeps bringing up this idea that you're not free to be an autonomous being, right? You're not free this way. Hauerwas, when he makes that claim, he's pulling something from pre-modernity. He's saying one of the lies of modernity is that you get to make up your own story as you go. You don't actually get to do that, right? This is what Hauerwas is arguing against this. But that notion that's sort of deep in us that we're free and we get to choose what happens next, this is part of modernity, right? This is part of a philosophical system for seeing the world. Okay. Postmodernity is going to do something really weird with these two categories. They're going to kind of combine them. I don't have a great word for this. It's back to SCR, but this is really fragmented now. We're not going to spend very much time on this because it's just going to get confusing. But we can look at we can maybe look at this later in the semester if there's any of you guys that are really interested in this piece of like what does this move look like. We can spend some more time on it. But for our purposes now, the biggest thing is this individual free self, right? From here, this has been ruled out by postmodernism. Says that doesn't exist, right? Like whatever you thought this was isn't true. It might be something different. It might have some stuff in common with it, but it's not the same. Okay. I share all of that with you because when we talk about virtues, one of the mistakes we can make is that we start to think of virtues as individual choices, right? That if we just could muster up enough willpower, if we could work hard enough, we could be virtuous people. That's not what virtues are, right? That's not that. It's not a stoic category for self-discipline. That's not what we mean when we say virtues. Virtues are the goods, right, that get put into action that grow out of what our community values. This is the point Aristotle was making. This is the point pre-moderns understood, and it's something we lost for a couple hundred years here. But it's the kind of thing that somebody like Wendell Berry is trying to recapture, right? So if you want to think about the article now, we're going to shift to this piece about community, okay? I want to do some big picture stuff with this Wendell Berry article. And here's the biggest thing to understand from the Wendell Berry article is this. That humans can flourish best when they grow out of local communities that are healthy, local cultures that are healthy. Berry has this example he uses in the article of soil, right? When soil is good, plants can grow well. When soil is bad, plants will not grow. He says humans are the same way. When the soil is good, when the community is good and the community is healthy, you will grow into fully this kind of virtuous people that you're meant to be. When the community is when it's broken or when it doesn't work, this life of virtue becomes almost impossible. Okay, you can't overcome your community. That's in a nutshell what Berry is arguing for. He says the job of local culture is to create the space through a collection of memories, ways, and skills to create the space for this kind of growth towards virtue. That's how I read Berry. I think that's what he's trying to do. Or the job of local culture is to pass on the tools necessary to make virtue possible. That's what's going on, right? Okay, and that would be fine, except for we run into a problem right away. And if you've read the Berry article, which I know like half of you have, half of one of you have, the problem we run into is that local communities are dying, right? That the thing that's meant to help us become flourishing, virtuous people keeps getting diminished, right? And he has 4 reasons they get diminished. We're going to look at all 4 of them quickly, but one of them we're going to look at pretty closely. The first one is the city versus rural distinction. So he's saying local rural communities especially are dying, and they're dying because of cities, right? Here's what you need to think about when you think about cities. You guys live in a city. You understand this to some degree, right? We don't grow our own food in our city. We don't get our own water from our city. If we do all this stuff that comes from outside of us, that comes from rural places that are not the city. The city itself is a collection of people, but we exist as a collection because of jobs and the Industrial Revolution. right? This is the kinds of cities that we have when you think about cities used to not exist this way, right? These are new inventions of modernity. And in this invention of modernity, somebody like Berry's going to say, well, we've lost what we gave up when we got modernity. Some of the stuff we gave up we still need, and we need those local communities, right? So cities are one of the things that get in the way of local communities thriving. The second way is connected to that, but he's going to say economic and social standards that come from outside of us, right? That come from outside of those communities. So his example of this is television, right? Television and marketing. He's going to say one of the things that happens to local communities and local rural communities in particular is they're taught all the time through television and through sales and through marketing that what they really need to be is more like cities, right? That have you guys ever been to a town that doesn't have a McDonald's? Right? Like, there's not very many of them, right? Like, you can find them. Yeah, it happens, right? But you almost have to look for them. This is part of what he's naming. So he says economic and social standards set by television and salesmen and outside experts. This is the second kind of piece. And then he also says as local community decays with local economy, because your economy can't work in itself, you need to order it from Amazon and do all these other pieces. When that happens, a vast amnesia settles over the countryside, which is like just, that's sort of Wendell Berry's writing style, right? You can close that if you want, Isabel. You can close the door. Jerry's not Isabel. All right. Then the third thing, and this is the one we're going to spend more time on. So we have a few minutes I want to spend on this. This is a bigger deal. All right, I'm going to write it on the board. Some of you won't be able to see it, but this is what he's going to call the inversion of return. Or inversion of the pattern of return. All right, so for Berry, he's going to say if you look throughout history, there is the same pattern shows up over and over and over again. It shows up in literature, it shows up in just stories we tell each other, and it shows up in communities all the time. That there is a pattern, a pattern of return. What happens is you grow up, you age, and as you become an adult, you intentionally rebel against your parents. All right, it's just something that has to happen. It's a natural sort of order of things. You rebel against your parents, and when you rebel against your parents, you go off somewhere else, you discover wisdom, you do something else, and then you eventually return, right? And that return is crucial because you return to a place and you return to a people. You return to your family and you return to your place so that you can contribute and grow the place and the people you're from, right? So that rebellion is not a rebellion that lasts forever, and in droves you would come back. I'll give you a stat on this. It's semi-made up because I couldn't find the exact stat when I looked it up earlier. When my parents' generation was born, their parents, at something like 85% of my parents' generation, so my grandparents' generation, 85% of them lived within 10 miles of where they were born. My parents' generation, that number dropped to about 30%. And in my generation, that number is something like 8 to 10%. All right? Those numbers are not exact, but they're the rough sort of breakdown. All right? Think about this for a second. How many of you live within 10 miles of where your parents were born? No one in the room, right? How many of you live within 100 miles of where your parents were born?
One of them.
One of them? All right, yeah. Right? I don't do that either. Right? So this is not a value claim here, right? But this is what Berry's mentioning. That this pattern of return has stopped happening. It gets inverted. Right? So what happens is at your age, you rebel, you go off, and you don't come back anymore. Right? And not you guys specifically. My generation didn't come back. My parents' generation didn't come back. Right? This is a real thing that happens. Right? Sociologically, we can chart this. But Berry's saying we usually tell that story as a positive. right? It's like, what can you do when you get to be an adult? Well, I can go off to college, right? And then I can get a job and I can move away from my parents. All of that's fine. There's an impulse there that's true, right? But when you don't return, what ends up suffering? The exact local community that's meant to be the thing that teaches you virtue, right? And so this is Berry's argument. There's a whole section as he goes through this, but I want to read you just a small part of this because I want you to hear what he's naming here. Children go to cities, and for reasons imposed by external economy, right, this is the second point, imposed by these outside economies, they do not return, and eventually the parents die and the family land is passed on, usually to a stranger. He says that pattern, which started happening in the 17 and 1800s, now has happened probably 1 million times. And he says, according to this new norm, this inversion, the child's destiny is not to succeed the parents, but to outmode them. Succession is given way to supersession. Here's his point. Your job, and the way, if I asked you guys, if I could figure out a right way to ask the question, you would almost all tell me the same thing. Your job is to have a better life than your parents. Right? How many of your parents have told you that? Right? My parents did, right? They work hard so that you can have a better life. That's the point. That's the way we narrate this story. That's new. Okay, that has not always been the case. And it seems innocuous, it seems safe on the front end. But this is Berry's argument. Once that norm of you have to outdo your parents is institutionalized, right? And it's not institutionalized in these communities of virtue, it becomes institutionalized in our education system. So the education system exists to help you be better than your parents. But we don't mean better as virtuous people. We mean better as in you make more money or have better jobs than they had, right? Once we do that, the schools are no longer oriented towards a cultural inheritance which is their duty to pass on unimpaired, but instead, schools have to become oriented towards career, right? So schools become oriented towards what job you can get. When we ask you, why do you go to school? So you can go to another school, right? Why'd you go to middle school? So you can go to high school. Why do you go to high school? So you can go to college. Why do you go to college? So you can get a good job, right? That's the carrot at the end of that stick every time, to get a good job. Here's Berry's point about getting a good job. The orientation towards that good job is by necessity theoretical and speculative. You can't know it, right? You might be in high school right now and think, I want to be an accountant. Okay, great. So you're going to go be an accountant, but that job doesn't exist yet, right? In your head, that's all hypothetical. That's all future-oriented stuff that we're just guessing on. The difference between that and I'm going to go learn how cows have babies so that I can go back to my family farm and run my family farm is different, right? Because when you imagine that job, you have 3 generations of people that live with you who do that job, right? Some of you guys have that, by the way. I'm throwing all of you under the same bus. I throw me under the same bus too. But some of you have dads or moms who do a job that you're going to go to school so you can come back and run their company, right? Or you can come back and do the work they're doing. That's different than I think I might like to do this other thing, right? And that orientation, the difference between those two things is your community, right? You have somebody in your life who can show you what this is. For Aristotle, the example he used for virtue was a plumber, right? Or something like a plumber in his day, right? And the point is, if you want to become a good plumber, you don't go off to university to take plumbing classes. We don't even offer them. What do? You find a good plumber, right? And you just follow that plumber around forever. And that plumber will teach you to be a good plumber, and then someday you'll teach somebody else to be a good plumber. And that's how you learn how to be good. Berry has the same idea in mind, but he has it about community. And then the last thing that happens, the fourth factor that destroys local communities is a lack of place, right? That you start to define community as something other than place. And here's a quote from Berry that to me is just like, this sums up a ton of what he's about. But if the word community is to mean or amount to anything, It must refer to a place in its natural integrity and its people. It must refer to a placed people. I want you to think about this for a second. We're going to end on this. This is the last thing we're going to do. When we use the word community, when we talk about community, how often do we mean place? Right? This is Barry's pushing on us because he's going to say it's always meant place. It always means people and place together. We use community largely now to talk about people. Right? So one of the examples that's close to home for most of you is we talk about the Hispanic community, right? You guys have heard this language, right? So if I say, let's talk about the Hispanic community, what place does the Hispanic community have?
Latin America?
Yeah, right? Potentially Latin America, right? And depending on which version of Hispanic, it might not even be that, right? There might be other spots. What about the African American community?
America?
Right? We have it in the name, but what's necessary to develop the community here, right? One of the things that happens is you guys have become part of a community that exists without any place, right? Or you exist in a place where you're far away from your place, right? So you might have a Hispanic community in Milwaukee, but Milwaukee doesn't sustain this community the same way somewhere else might, right? Like that's a tricky spot to recognize that there's something about place that's really important. I don't know how you can short circuit that or how you can develop it beyond that. I just want you to recognize that some of the things your parents have sacrificed to help you get to where you are, one of those things might have been place, right? That they've moved or they've like really moved a long way away or moved away from family, all these other things that help us make sense out of our lives. When you run into this, there's a quote from Barry. I was going to see if I can find it really quickly. He says, when you don't have place, when you don't have local community this way, and you revert away from this returning, he says, in the present economy where individual dependencies are so much exterior, right, to both household and community, family members often have no practical need or use for one another. The reason you come together, the reason you keep forming family communities is because you like them. So when you stop liking them, you stop coming around, right? Because you don't have a family business that holds you together. You don't have a family place that holds you together, right? This is what he's naming. And when that happens, he says, hence the frequent futility of attempts at a purely psychological or emotional reconciliation. One of the reasons we struggle with mental health, this is where all of this ends up going. One of the reasons we struggle with mental health is because we've given away local communities. We don't have place the same way anymore. Schools try to fill that gap. Churches sometimes try to fill that gap, but there is a basic human need to be from somewhere, right? And man, when you're from the city, the goal for you is almost always to get out of the city, right? It's like if you come back to the city after you've gone off to college, you failed somehow. That's not true, right? You can recover some sense of place here. I don't know how we do that, but that's something we're gonna need to work on, okay? So that's a ton of stuff. You guys have those notes. We've got like a minute left if you wanna catch your breath for a second and then head off to advisory.
What do you mean if you